Fighting Through Second World War podcast, episode 79, German Submariner and POW, part 2. More great unpublished history. During the night, 4 more ships of our convoy had been torpedoed by midnight, and it became clear that U-boats were operating among this convoy, surfacing and firing torpedoes at will. While we were recovering the survivors, our sonar operator reported a U-boat echo, which placed it directly under our stern. There was only one answer: to get away quickly and depth charge. I was in the bow sound detecting station at the very front of the boat. The engine sounds of our attacker were pounding in my headphones. He was directly above us. Then 4 splashes, and seconds later 4 explosions rocked our boat. They went down to the driveway and hollered out to the neighbour, but did not get an answer. They checked the outbuildings and no sign of him there either. They went down to the cellar from the outside entrance and were astonished at what they saw. Welcome back to part 2 of this splendid memoir of a German submariner in the Second World War, fighting in the cold North Atlantic. And if you want to see just how cold, check out Kurt's brilliant picture set in the full show notes at the website. And if you didn't get the hint in those intro passages, I'll mention that I've managed to dig up another North Atlantic memoir to share with you, where the coincidences are almost too spooky to contemplate. Keep listening for the PS. Oh my word. And more details later of Kurt's memoir, which has been superbly published by son Rainer in The German Immigrant. More info on that at the end of the show. Before we get underway, I've just got to share this bit of instant feedback on the last episode, because I can, and you'll understand why when I tell you. Hi Paul, I just listened to episode 78. Thank you so much for doing this. What a wonderful job you did. Listening to you tell my dad's stories brought tears to my eyes. It took me back to when I was a youngster, sitting on my dad's lap as he told me these very same stories. Well done, Rainer, son of Kurt Schoenthier. Well, all I can say is, how good is that? Thanks for that feedback, Rainer. You've made my day. Glad you enjoyed it. And of course, there's still more to come. We left the last episode witnessing Kurt's scary initiation ceremony on crossing the equator for the first time. Well, he got through that in one piece, and we catch up with Kurt cruising the ocean once more, looking for enemy ships. The sinking. My dad was a wireless radio man on U-111, and this is how he recalled the day of their sinking. I was in the bow sound detecting station between the torpedoes at the very front of the boat. The engine sounds of our attacker were pounding in my headphones. He was directly above us. Then 4 splashes, and seconds later 4 explosions rocked our boat. Depth charges. Deafening thunder amplified 100-fold for me through the sound detector headphones. My eardrums. For several moments I was stunned and couldn't hear a thing. In bewilderment, I turned around. Everyone was gone. As I took off my earphones and began to regain my hearing, I heard machine gun fire. We were on the surface. Then the sound of our 2-centimetre gun firing. Another explosion. I hurried towards the radio room. Nobody there. I got to the control room just as Stefek's lifeless body fell to the floor in front of me, the right side of his body mutilated. The sweet smell of burnt flesh and gunpowder brought me to the brink of vomiting. Then I saw Harbour coming down the ladder, his face white as a ghost, shaking terribly. "Stay down here," he shouted to me. "They're all dead up there." He'd manned our 2-centimetre gun when a direct hit from the enemy's 4-inch gun exploded on the bridge of U-111, killing Captain Kleinschmidt, Lieutenants Fuchs and Rösing, and gunners Gross, Pühlehorn, Default and Steffek. Meanwhile, our 10.5-centimetre gun at the bow, just in front of the conning tower, was manned by 4 men awaiting ammunition. Steffek and the captain were bringing up a shell for this gun when the 4-inch shell from the enemy hit, killing both of them. Seconds later, another shell exploded behind our 10.5 centimetres, wounding 2 men and damaging the gun. I was still in the control room when Lieutenant Wolf came running from the diesel engine room. "Everybody off the boat, we're going down." I realised that I had to find a life jacket if I wanted to survive. Oh yes, did I mention? I can't swim! Anyways, mine was stored in the radio room under the seat, but it's gone. Another shout through the bulkhead. "Everybody out, we're going down." I finally found a swim vest, and while blowing it up through the mouthpiece, I rushed up the ladder to the conning tower. I glanced over, and there, sprawled beside the periscope, I saw the upper body of Captain Kleinschmidt. His body had been torn in half by the shell. I reached the conning tower where a large hole had been blasted through the wall, and there sat Fuchs, a smile on his face, and a huge hole clean through his chest, and not a drop of blood. Then 4 more bodies across my path. I slid down the ladder to the deck. In the distance, I saw our attacker with a small British flag on her mast, and a quick thought ran through my mind. The enemy! What are they going to do to us? I noticed that in the water between them and our boat, some of my buddies were already swimming. Lieutenant Wolf came sliding down the ladder, shouting, "Get off the boat! Get off the boat!" Hannes, Notke, Hein Riemann, Walter Bittner and myself stood on the edge of the boat, now knee-deep under water. "We'd better be jumping," said Hannes. We jumped, and after a few seconds in the water, I heard someone shout, "Our Führer, our fatherland, U-111, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah!" And the rest of us answered, "Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah!" I turned around to see the bow of our U-111 straight up in the air, and then slowly slide into the depths. Gone. My dad watched as his boat slowly disappeared beneath the waves. He recalls what happened next. U-111 is gone. I can't swim, so now my life depends on my life vest. Luckily the water is warm and only slightly rough. The waves were high enough, however, to cover my view, and I can't see the others. I'm alone. I can still see the ship that sank us, but it is sailing away. They're leaving. But this isn't the only fear getting a hold of me. I realise my life vest is leaking. The right side of the vest has gone flat, and I'm floating lopsided. The vest has several separate compartments, and 2 of them are leaking. Frantically searching, I notice the cause, 2 small holes about 2 inches apart, and the thickness of a pencil. I'm scared stiff. I feel myself starting to panic. I begin to lose hope. I'm going to drown. It's just a matter of time. In a futile attempt, I shove my fingers into the holes and keep blowing air into the mouthpiece, desperately trying to keep it inflated and stay afloat. Using only one arm to move about, I'm losing all sense of direction. I can't see any of the others. I begin to shout, "Hilfe! Hilfe!" Then my call is returned, "Hilfe!" I turn around and see Alfred Harm. He's about 50 metres away, frantically shouting and waving his arms. Then, as I look in his direction, I can suddenly see the bow of our attacker behind him. It's coming straight at us. In a few seconds, it stops right beside me. It's now been over an hour since U-111 went down, and the British didn't leave. They've been circling to find survivors. Freddie and I are the last two in the water. We could easily have been left unnoticed. If not for the humane actions of the ship's captain, who kept circling just once more in case there were any stragglers like myself and Freddie, I would be gone. I'm almost touching the wall of the ship now. It's slowly moving forward, and then I'm hit by a rope ladder dangling over the side. I look up, and someone above is motioning for me to climb up. I am so exhausted I can't even manage to pull myself out of the water, much less climb up. In a desperate struggle, I finally manage to hook one leg through the bottom rung and sling one arm over another. Then I lock hands and try to gather my strength for an attempt to climb up, when to my astonishment I suddenly begin to rise out of the water. I was being pulled up by two British sailors. As they help me climb over the railing, a third sailor is pointing a gun at me and says, "Hands up." I've no idea what he's saying. Upon seeing the unintelligible look on my face and seeing how exhausted I am and wearing only a pair of shorts, I must appear to be pretty harmless. So he says, okay, lowers his gun and helps me climb on board. Now the four of us are standing face to face. The one with the gun is pointing at me again. We stare at each other for a few seconds. Then one of the two that had pulled me up out of the water steps towards me. Instinctively, I take a step back. He takes another step toward me. I brace myself for the worst. Then he lights up a cigarette and hands it over to me. "Smoke," he says. No knowledge of the English language is needed for me to understand this. I will never forget this gesture, thinking that only a short while ago we were trying to kill these guys, and they were trying to kill us. But now the enemy suddenly had a face, and they had saved us. Along with my feelings of fear and uncertainty, I now also felt a sense of relief as I realised that I'd stepped off the devil's shovel once again. Submariner adds the following poignant message to this episode. My dad and Freddie were the last of their crew to be pulled out of the water. They both went on to live long lives. They were the last two of their crew to die, and their birthdays were on the same day. They passed away within a short time of each other. 1941, captured, the land of milk and honey. On October the 4th, 1941, my dad's boat U-111 was sunk. Survivors were rescued and taken aboard by their attacker, HMS Lady Shirley, a fishing trawler that had been converted to a submarine hunter. They were then transported to Gibraltar, where they were held for a few weeks, and then they were, well, I'll let my dad tell it from here. After a few weeks in Gibraltar, rumours began to spread about a transfer to Australia, or England, or even Canada. I knew that some of my friends fighting on the Eastern Front had been captured by Russian troops. My mind drifted to something my father had said a few months earlier during my last leave home. He'd been a soldier in World War I, 2 years in France and 2 years in Russia. His opinion of the Russians was low. "Son," he told me, "I'm glad you're fighting in the West, and even though we were enemies, We always respected the British for their fairness. The rumour of a transfer soon became fact. We were being shipped to England. We were loaded onto the aircraft carrier Argus, escorted by 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers. We entered the Atlantic. Unlike the violent movements of U-111 in the high seas, this large monster of a sea vessel tried in a quite different way to twist our guts. The heaving upward motion seemed endless, and so did the dipping back down. But no matter how hard Neptune tried, our seasoned bellies refused to give in, and we consumed every bit of the excellent sailor rations that we now received. Things are going to be different as soon as we're put in a POW camp. We were sure of that. Especially on the British Isles. Food supplies must be getting short there, the way our subs are controlling their shipping lanes. Hell, why the English going to all this trouble anyway? The war will be over shortly. Why don't they just send us home? We were quite certain there'd be peace with England after our soon-to-be victory over Russia. This kind of optimism carried myself and others through all the weeks, months, and years of captivity ahead. After a few days we arrived at our destination, and the Argus dropped anchor at Greenock. News of the arrival of a captured U-boat crew had spread quickly, and there was a rather large crowd waiting alongside the pier. But wait a minute, this reception looked different from what we were accustomed to. Where are all the friendly girls, the brass band, and the Admiral? No, we were in enemy territory now, and we got what we deserved. Jeers and boos, throat-cutting gestures, SOBs, and other names shouted in our direction. What else could we expect? The guards escorted us past the crowd to an awaiting bus. Quick, quick, muck and schnell, muck and schnell. This we understood, and had heard many times already. The windows of the bus were painted black. Only a small strip at the top was left clear. Behind the driver, a curtain blocked our view to the front. "Nobody stand up, or we'll shoot," a guard hollered. There were 3 armed guards at the front of the bus, and 2 more behind us. We started talking amongst ourselves. "Shut up! No talk!" One of us raised his arm. "I go toilet?" And the swift reply, "You wait, go toilet in camp." Then 2 more arms in the air. "Me toilet, please." The 2 gave the impression that soon something disgusting was going to happen. "Diarrhea," another one of us shouted. This broke the guards' resistance, and the bus stopped. The 3 complainers were told to get out, along with half a dozen others, who now also suddenly had to go. The rest of us rose and and peeked out through the clear glass at the top of the windows. We'd stopped on an isolated stretch of road, and the guys were told to do their business on the roadside. After some stalling and goofing around, a sudden gunshot in the air by the impatient guard brought things to a quick end, and everyone was rushed back on the bus, with or without business completed. The truth was, no one really had to go. It was all just a dumb joke, but we had something to laugh about. Then we arrived at the camp. It would be the first of several in England. As we'd anticipated, the food supply was low and the weather was cold. What news we had of the war was not good, and as the weeks and months wore on, I slowly became very depressed. My dream of the war being over and being home by Christmas was gone. A rumour had begun to spread that we'd be transferred to Canada, and it turned out to be true. England was having enough difficulty feeding her own people, let alone a bunch of enemy prisoners. Why not ship us to Canada, where there was food aplenty? I watched enviously as some of my friends were picked to be sent to the promised land. For many of us, the word Canada meant something like the land of milk and honey. We imagined it to be as in the books we'd read as kids. Wide open skies and vast forests, lumberjacks, prairies, huge buffalo herds, and of course, Indians. We were willing to gamble a couple of weeks of fear to get there. Fear of going in a convoy and being sunk by one of our own U-boats. My name was on the list for the next to go, along with a few others from our boat. We hoped for fog and a fast ship. Several hundred Canadian soldiers were also on board, and we were separated by barbed wire. One of us called over to the other side. "How do you guys like being behind barbed wire?" A few more friendly jabs were exchanged, and soon we were all joking and talking. We traded uniform buttons, swastika emblems, and so on for chocolate bars and cigarettes. We got our wish, as it turned out to be a speedy crossing, and we soon approached the Canadian eastern seaboard. The crew of U-111 remembered this area all too well, as only 10 months ago we were patrolling these very waters, searching for a vessel like the one we were on right now. At that time, a thick layer of fog had begrudged us the opportunity of finding a target. Would the fog, our nemesis from then, become friendly and protect us now? It did. Because of the protective fog, our journey took a day longer. But when it lifted, there it was. Canada, the land of milk and honey. A long train was waiting for us at Halifax. Good Lord, those Pioneer coaches are huge compared to our trains back home. Armed guards were stationed at both ends of the coach. The luggage compartments are to be used for storage of your belongings only, not for sleeping, so you can't cut your way out to freedom at night, and also not more than one at a time to stand up. One of us asked, "When are we going to arrive at camp?" "Won't be long, 2 days or so." 2 days? So we go to BC? Hell no, that would take 6 days. This is Canada, you know. One of us tried to be funny. "You have lots to eat in Canada. We're growing enough to feed the whole world. If you SOBs would only let us ship it to everyone. Just get us some of this stuff now, please. We're starving." Wait until the train's moving. Finally, the train started to roll, and the food came as promised. Crates of apples first, then loaves of white bread, followed by an abundance of sausages. Many of us heard the word bologna for the first time. It soon became our universal name for any type of sausage. And then coffee. Real coffee, made from coffee beans. We praised Columbus for discovering America. The train rolled on westwards. Always westwards. Bush, bush, and more bush. The landscape confirmed our conceptions of the land. Trees and lumberjacks. A dog sledge running alongside the train caught our attention, but our hope of a gang of Indians attacking the train was not realised. We'd all played cowboys and Indians during our childhood, based on books we'd read about the great tribes and chiefs. But then came Hitler, and we switched to playing soldiers and war. It was undeniable, even at night, that we were riding through a strange land. Finally, the forest opened up, and there it was, our first home in Canada, Camp number 23, Monteith, Ontario. Watchtowers and barbed wire. There were 1,600 of us in the camp. Initially, life in camp was boring. There were daily duties like kitchen work, camp maintenance work, and so forth. The International Red Cross, Salvation Army, and the YMCA provided books for the library, including books from Germany. Our soldiers' salary payments were continued and transferred to our bank accounts in Germany. Part of it was sent over for our disposal. General men received $6.60, non-commissioned officers $11, and officers $30 per month. The general store in camp became a money magnet. It had a selection of toiletry articles, smokes, chocolate, razor blades, etc. A pack of 20 smokes was 20 cents, a bar of soap 7 cents. Some of us got to work outside the camp, general maintenance of roads, barracks of the guards, laundry, unloading of supplies, etc. The pay was 20 cents for a 6-hour day, while in-camp work was not paid. One day, Alex, our work manager, asked for 2 volunteers with painting experience. No arms went up. My friend Carl elbowed me in the ribs and said, "Come on, let's try it." I said, "OK, sure, how hard can it be?" Our task was to paint the outside of a small shed that housed the camp's fire truck. At day's end, the guards were pleased with our work and asked, "Do you guys want to do more paint work?" "Hell yeah," we replied. What an opportunity! We now had a supply of paint that we could trade to the other guys for smokes and chocolate. A lot of guys spent their time tinkering, making little models and so on out of wood, and they needed paint, and now Carl and I had it. Every day for the next 6 months, our names were automatically called for paint work. Kurt Schoenthier became a routine sound to be called out every morning by Alex, and we knew just how to smuggle the paint back to the guys. Small glass jars like mustard jars and small tin cans filled with paint and fastened to a string dangled safely between our legs and passed through countless body searches back in camp. We knew the guards were too embarrassed to get close to that area during their searches. Oh dear. More and more of the men became aware of our little enterprise, and no matter how much we supplied, we couldn't keep up with the demand. Business was booming. We figured that our crime of stealing was offset by the good deed we provided towards our fellow prisoners. Besides, if we were caught, what would they do? Throw us in prison? The appearance of the mailman was always a favourite part of the day, although all too often it was sad news from home. In the first 6 months, 3 of my best friends from home were killed, followed shortly by 2 more. Many others serving on various U-boats were listed missing in action. We all knew what that meant. In 1943, we lost 42 subs in 1 month alone. Susie and Nellie were 2 of the most popular characters in camp. We'd found them, motherless, wandering alone in the bush. They were 2 orphaned black bear cubs. The camp commander allowed us to keep them, and they quickly became our favourite pets. They were allowed to walk freely throughout the camp. They were housed in a small log cabin in the middle of the camp and received meals in their own quarters. One day, Susie got into an altercation with one of the guards, during which she nibbled slightly on his butt. Unfortunately, both her and Nellie had to pay a high price for this insubordinate behaviour, and they were now fenced into a small enclosure around their cabin. To our amusement, they could still enjoy chasing each other up and down a big old tree and sliding under a little bridge we'd made for them. As time went on, they became too big for this, and one day Nellie got stuck. Destruction of the bridge was the only way out. Both seemed to enjoy their life as fellow prisoners. Their world was their territory of the camp, but inevitably their inborn desire for freedom developed until one day it became powerful enough for Susie to break through the fence of their little home. Obviously excited and bewildered about the success of her breakout, Susie ran to the camp fence and climbed over, only to be shot and killed moments later. Nellie, after watching what had happened to her sister, got frenzied, and as a precautionary measure, was also shot and killed. The flag was flown at half-mast that day. Winter 1943. On thin ice. In the winter of 43, my dad was a POW in Canada in a small camp on the Quebec side of the Ottawa River. They were cutting trees for the Gillies Brothers Lumber Company. The logs would be loaded onto large trucks and driven to the trains at Chalk River on the Ontario side. It was hard work, but they enjoyed it. They worked mostly unsupervised, as any attempts at escape in this frozen wilderness would surely end in death. During the cold of winter, when the river froze, the trucks would drive across it on the ice, roughly half a mile, saving them considerable time. Most of the time things went smoothly. There had, however, been a bit of a mild spell, and the ice wasn't quite as solid as the truckers would like it. One by one, they took their heavy loads across the treacherous ice. Then it was Jack Rubishaw's turn. My dad went back and found the old camp 45 years later in 1988 and was able to get in touch with Jack, who still lived in the area. Here in his own words, Jack Rubishaw tells the story. It was February 1943, temperatures around minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, snow about 24 inches deep. It was a mild spell. The POWs were cutting lumber in the Laurentian Hills for Gillies Brothers Lumber Company. They'd haul the logs on big sleds down to the river, where they were loaded onto our trucks. About 15 local truckers, including myself, were hauling the logs from Cheyenne Point on the Quebec side across the frozen Ottawa River to the trains at Chalk River and transported south. That morning, my brother-in-law was the first to cross and made it to the Ontario side safely. He was not aware of what was happening beneath him. The ice was about 24 inches thick, but due to the extreme low temperature, the ice had shattered with the weight of the truck. A second truck followed, Midori, from the town of Arnprior. Just 300 yards from the Ontario side, his truck began to sway and started sinking. He jumped from the cab safely. I had just come off the mountain with a full load. The driver for Midori's truck was running across the ice to warn me, but I was already on the ice. I turned and headed back for the Quebec shore. Within seconds, the rear of the truck broke through the ice. The front wheels of the cab were in the air, and it broke loose from the loaded trailer. I jumped clear of the drowning truck. The motor was still running. The cab went down in a depth of 97 feet of water. However, the loaded trailer floated in the broken ice. The POWs came and helped me to unload the wood and clear the ice. It was extremely cold, difficult and dangerous work. They worked side by side with me. I was very grateful, since this was my only source of living to support my family. Some of the men were divers on their German ships. They lamented that if they had their equipment, they could have raised that truck with no damage. The next day, one of the men, who was a blacksmith, forged some grappling hooks. They dropped the hooks below the ice and attached with ropes to a team of 4 horses. Up came the hood and one fender. On the next try, we retrieved a door. Then we caught onto the frame of the truck. It was submerged in mud. In order to lift it, another truck and the horses pulled together. On the 5th day, we hooked onto the rear end. As we worked in that freezing cold, the POWs kept a huge bonfire burning close by. We took breaks for hot tea, blackstrap molasses, bread and bologna for lunch. There was a good rapport between the POWs and those Canadians. I brought them candy, cigarettes and newspapers. There was lots of good-natured teasing from both sides regarding the events and the ongoing war, and I much appreciated their willingness to help me. Jack Rubishaw. Not long after, The warm spell was over, and the ice became usable once more as a temporary highway for the truckers, and also for us POWs to cross and return to the main camp at Chalk River. With melancholy in our hearts, we left behind the feeling of a little bit of freedom, and the echo of the lumberjacks' calls, "Timber!" didn't make our departure any easier. Trapper Joe. In 1943, my dad was a POW, working in a lumber camp deep in the bush of northern Ontario. POWs worked alongside professional Canadian lumberjacks and quickly learned the tricks of the trade. Working largely unsupervised, this was like freedom compared to the fenced-in and guarded main camp back in Monteith. A few days after Christmas 43, they were given a couple of days off. Just on a whim, my dad and two buddies asked the sergeant in charge if they could do a little cross-country skiing, and to their surprise, the answer was yes. I'll let my dad tell the story. We'd made ourselves 3 pairs of skis. We cut a 7-foot-long log, stroke by stroke, lengthwise, until we had the 6 strips ready. Then we planed them with the homemade plane that Hannes, who was a blacksmith back home, had made. He also made the flat iron for the tips, which we'd bent after getting them soft and flexible over the steam from boiling water. Ernst, who was a skiing expert back home, had made the binding for us. It was no patent binding, however. Once tied to the boots, they were on to stay. Look, Sarge, we don't want to escape. Just have a little hike inland, you know. Only 2 days at the most, and we'll be back by the evening of New Year's Day. The sergeant was a softy. He said yes. But then he also added, if you aren't back in time, you will be caught and shot. He knew darn well how senseless it would be for us to try and make a run for it in the middle of winter, up north in the Canadian bush with no supplies. "Say hello to Trapper Joe for me if you find him," he said. That was our plan. Trapper Joe was an Indian who'd passed through the camp a few days earlier. He'd told Carl and me where he would go, and for us to come and visit him for a cup of coffee. And so we set out, Hannes, Carl and myself on our homemade skis, into the wilderness. It was a beautiful day. Bright blue sky, no wind, about -30 degrees centigrade. One of those wonderful crispy winter days there are so many of in Canada's north. We pushed on, and after about 3 hours we came upon the lake Joe had mentioned. "You'll see a rocky hill on the other side," he'd told us. "This is where I will be." The lake measured about 3 kilometres across, and the rocky hill was clearly visible on the other side. Behind the hill rose a thin sliver of white smoke, rising straight up into the blue sky. Not the slightest hint of a breeze was perceivable, and there was complete silence. For several moments the 3 of us just stood there in awe and admiration, captivated by the beauty of the majestic scene before us. Almost hesitating to disrupt this heavenly peace, we slowly let ourselves glide downwards onto the frozen lake, and with long strides continued to search for the trapper. We found him. At the south side of the hill, the rock rose up rather steeply and close to it. Joe had stretched a canvas over 2 wooden poles to make a shelter. He'd left a narrow slit for the smoke from the log on his campfire to escape. "Hungry?" he asked, and his weather-beaten face grinned as he said, "Welcome." Another log a few feet away from the burning one on the fire provided enough sitting space for the 3 of us. Roasting over the fire was a rabbit he'd caught, in the hope that we would keep the promise we had made to come and see him. A pan, a kettle, and a metal mug was all he had. He put the rabbit on the pan, scraped off the burnt flesh with his huge hunting knife, and cut up the rest. He then offered for us to help ourselves. "Not bad. Wunderbar," we offered, with what little English we knew, and he acknowledged our compliment with another wide grin. The coffee he'd brewed was ready too. Hot and bitter, it nevertheless tasted good after our long stretch of skiing this morning. There was no big conversation, other than him going over to his sleigh to uncover it and show us his collection of furs. A narrow line of clouds was forming on the western horizon, and Joe warned us that snow was coming. Better be heading homewards. Don't want to be caught in a snowstorm. "Many thanks, Joe." He grabbed our hands and shook them wildly. "Come again, come again." And so we took off, homeward bound. If this was summer, we would be tempted to forget the camp and just keep going. The sergeant had given us a couple of days' headway. But don't kid yourself, in the summer he wouldn't trust us this way. Nevertheless, an idea was born. In the spring, we would build a raft and sail to freedom. Medicine Hat, summer 1944. It was late summer 44, and I was a prisoner of war in Camp 132, Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada. For 2 long years, no new prisoners had been added to the camp to join us. Suddenly one day, quite a contingent of new POWs arrived. We gathered at the camp gate and watched as they were slowly marched in. I quickly saw that there were some older Navy men among them. I noticed that 2 of the new guys kept looking over at me, and then one of them shouted, "Hey, Kurt, what a place to meet again, eh?" I didn't recognise them, and a thought flashed through my mind as they hurried in my direction with their arms outstretched to greet me. I'd sure like to know who the hell these old guys are. They were 2 U-boat men, obviously, because I noticed the decorations on their chests, but why would the Navy all of a sudden have 60-year-old men in the U-boat force? Were they now drafting men from World War I? I couldn't figure this out, but gradually they began to look familiar. As they were practically tearing out my arms, shaking hands and hugging me, I desperately concentrated, trying to recognise them, and then one of them said, "Oh, Kurt, where did the time go?" "I see you were puzzled. 4 years ago, U-boat school in Neustadt. Don't you remember?" Now it was coming back to me. I felt embarrassed that I hadn't recognised them. This was George Saltzman and Gert Zimmer, my friends from U-boat school. But their features, their faces, they weren't 60-year-olds. They were 24, same as me. The only difference was that they had not been captured until a few weeks ago. One of them had weathered 19 combat patrols, and the other 17 patrols while serving on various U-boats. They were highly decorated and advanced in ranks, and I envied them both. But only for a second or so. Then I realised the price they had paid, the toll the war had taken on them physically and mentally, turning them into almost unrecognisable old men. I realised once more how lucky I'd been to be sunk and captured in 1941, and then become a POW in Canada. In the summer of 46, while still POWs up north, they were given the opportunity to work on farms in southern Ontario. My dad decided to give it a shot. They were brought to a small camp near Fingal, Ontario. I was picked up at the Fingal camp by a man named Bill Dufty, who was there to take me to my assigned farm as a helper. "Call me Bill," he said, "and what's your name?" "Kurt Schoenthier, but call me Kurt," I replied. Smiling, he shook my hand and responded, "Kirk, eh? Did I say it right?" He swung one of my heavy sea sacks over his shoulder, and we walked through the camp gates to his car. "We're going to my nephew's farm. It'll take about 20 minutes. Soon he slowed down. We had arrived at the farm. I got out and opened the gate at the end of the long lane that led to the farm, and I noticed the name John McKinley on the mailbox. As we drove into the yard, I saw that John was already there to greet us. He was exactly what I had always pictured in my mind, what I imagined a farmer to be: tall, strong and proud. Blue coveralls, blue and white striped engineer's hat, and a big, warm, friendly smile. Before we came to a stop, a young woman stepped out of the house holding a baby, and a youngster ran past her in our direction. I had just opened the car door, and the little girl was already at my side, enthusiastically saying, "Hi, Uncle Bill. Is this the prisoner?" "His name is Kirk, Brenda, Kirk, and this is what you should call him." Bill rounded the front of the car and said, "John, this is Kurt Schoenthier. Oh, forget it. Just call him Kirk. And Kirk, this is John." John smiled and shook my hand in a way that immediately made me feel welcome, and told me my place here would be as a co-worker and friend, rather than just the prisoner. "My name is Kurt," I explained, and as we spoke the woman came down from the porch to where we were standing. "Glad to meet you, Kurt," John said, "and I'd like you to meet my wife Margaret. And Marge, this is Kurt. I said it right, didn't I?" Seeing my approving nod, John laughed at himself and said, "I didn't know I could speak German." The baby was introduced as Doug, who couldn't care less about me or my name, and quickly turned his head in the opposite direction. After a short farewell with Bill, we gathered up my sea sacks and turned towards the house. Once inside, John pointed to a room and said, "This is your room, Kurt, and the tobacco stuff on the little table is yours. Make yourself at home. We'll have lunch in a few minutes." My own room. I couldn't believe it. Then at lunch I felt very much like part of the family, brought on by the warmth and unprejudiced feelings that my new family showed me. I quickly realised I would need to improve my knowledge of the English language when little Brenda said, "You talk funny, Kirk." 1947 to 51. On returning to Germany in 1947, there's nothing for my dad. His family farm in the old village was now part of Poland and lost to them for good. He now had no money, no property of any kind, no job or income or place to live. He finally located family members, got married, and had me. He bounced from job to job, doing whatever menial work he could find. It was bleak to say the least. Then, in late 1950, out of the blue, came the letter from friends he'd made whilst a POW in Canada. Canada was now open to Germans, but needed a Canadian sponsor, which of course these friends would do. So, in early 1951, they came to Canada. My dad, my mum, his mum, and me. The Canadian economy was good, and my parents took full advantage. They both worked like dogs, bought a home, started their own business, and had a very successful life with many, many Canadian friends, and both lived to their late 90s. Well, what an excellent story that was. Talk about a tear-jerking end. What the poignancy of that finish. Rainer told me that his father, Kurt, passed away in 2016. And Rainer says that I live in St. Thomas, close to where he worked on the farm. And in Canada, he had a very full and successful life. eventually buying a home, operating several thriving businesses, an auto repair shop, planted his own apple orchard with over 4,000 trees, and he built cedar canoes plus more. No doubt a few pairs of skis. What a great payback to Canada on the kindness and hospitality it originally offered. Rainer, thanks for sharing your book with all us amateur historians, and I hope some professional historians. Great effort. If anybody's interested in buying this book, it's called The German Immigrant, and in it you can discover what it was like to be a school-aged boy growing up in Germany during Hitler's rise to power. Join him through his teen years, U-boat school, war patrols, Lorient in France, meeting Admiral Dönitz, equator rituals, sinking in the Atlantic, being captured, being a POW, lumberjack in the bush, escape attempts, Indian trappers, moonshine stills, ice road truckers, and much more. So The German Immigrant by Kurt Schoenthier is available direct from Lulu Publishing. Depending on where you live, you might find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble and others. And there's a link to Lulu in the show notes. And yes, that's the publisher, not the interior designer or the singer. That's an esoteric Brit joke, I'm afraid. Whilst we're on Germans in the war, up recently popped musician Nick Faint from New Zealand, and Nick has a fascinating family background that rings so many bells in other episodes we've heard in the past. Nick said, "I was born in Melbourne and my family are from there, but we moved over to New Zealand when I was a kid, so I'm a Kiwi now. I grew up reading war comics, playing with plastic toy soldiers and making up plastic models of various wars and having an idealised picture of what war was like. I was always upset that none of my relatives seemed to have taken a big part in the war. My grandfather ran an Air Force hospital on Papua New Guinea, and my other grandfather was deemed essential to the war effort and stayed in Australia. The old guy that lived next door to me was an armourer on fighter planes in the Pacific. One grandfather witnessed an American bomber crash landing and burning the crew, and that was very upsetting for him. I also had a great uncle Adrian Faint, who was a stretcher bearer in World War I on the Western Front and was mentioned in dispatches. He later became a fairly famous artist and worked on camouflage for the Australian Army in World War II. You know, listener, I tried to buy some camouflage trousers the other day, but I couldn't find any. Later on, I married a German woman and met her grandfather, Herbert Schultz, who was sent to fight on the Russian front for the German army at the age of 17. The first time I met him, he told me how he was the gun aimer on an 88mm cannon facing 500 Russian tanks near the end of the war. He was blown off the gun 3 metres into a cornfield and proudly showed me the shrapnel scars still in his leg. He went to hospital and ended up marrying the nurse who treated him, who I also met. He showed me his old black and white photo album with his war photos and pointed out many photos of men and said, "Tot, dead," until he grew too sad to go any further. He also showed me on a map the long retreat his unit undertook. They were sent to relieve Stalingrad, and when it fell before they got there, they had a long fighting withdrawal back through Eastern Europe. None of his relatives showed much interest in his experiences, and I think it was good for him to meet someone who wanted to hear. Later on, he started a charity for Russian orphans from Chernobyl, bringing them on holidays to his village in Germany. I wonder if this was part of his healing from his war experiences. He was very bitter about the bombing at the end of the war and had a theory that the Allies kept bombing a lot longer than was necessary. I am a singer-songwriter, and I wrote a song for Herbert called Song for the Bad Guys. He lived to 96 and only died a few years ago, smoking and drinking schnapps to the end. Nick Faint, Takaka, New Zealand. Nick, thanks for writing in. I've just been playing the instrumental version of your music in the background, and I'm going to play the full version to close the show later so people can enjoy the lyrics too. And that's Song for the Bad Guys, and it's from your album Next Exit from Babylon, and that's Nick Faint. And for anyone interested in downloading or hearing more of Nick's songs, there are 11 tracks on his brand new album. His music is hosted on the Bandcamp website, and there's a link to it in the show notes. There's a lot more material to come yet, so stay tuned. And a few reviews now, and this one's from X1X, who says, "Excellent podcast. My grandfather was a Green Howard, and I was a Howard. Keep the good podcasts up." And that's from Robbie Bighill from Australia. And Dan DCFRL from the USA said, "This podcast is a must for anyone who's interested in World War II history, especially if you want first-hand accounts from the veterans who were there." And that review was on Apple Podcasts. Happy Dad and Husband. Tell all your World War II friends, this podcast is awesome. Paul Cheall is a wonderful storyteller, a dedicated historian, and would give Sherlock Holmes a challenge as a detective. And that's John Muskego from Wisconsin. Picking up John's exhortations to tell all your friends. To be honest, just 2 would do to massively uplift my download numbers. And to help you with that very task, there's a special Tell a Friend tab on the menu of the Fighting Through Podcast homepage. That's fightingthroughpodcast.co.uk, as always. So please use that to spread the word about your favourite podcast. And in that spirit, I want to offer a quick thank you to everyone who consistently likes or shares my occasional posts on Facebook and Twitter. I don't do that many because I feel my resources are best spent producing episodes. So thanks to the following people amongst many others in this respect. I do notice your efforts and thank you very much. And that's to Dec Whittle, John Dady, Marcel Girard, Lee Patrick, Gail Staples, Gabrielle Cervantes, Danny Fontenot, Sue Weiss, Lee Owen, Matt Kane, Duncan Casmore, Tim Rainville, Faye Pineda, Eddie Toms, Mike Watson, Wendy Andrews, and last but certainly not least, Tori Fairchild. There will be more of you, and thank you all for your support from all over the world. And I'm chuffed to bits, so in return, that's your 5 milliseconds of fame. A few people have bought me a coffee now. There's Dean Duckett, who bought me a good handful of coffees through the new Ko-fi feature on the website. Look for the heart on the coffee cup logo. And cheers, Dean, you're keeping me keen. Lisa Loftis from Springfield in Missouri also sent me some coffees through Ko-fi. And she says, "Just a token of thanks for the many hours of work you put into each show. It's much appreciated. Every time I tune in, whether I'm listening to an episode for the first time or listening again to a favourite episode, I always learn something new. Your work is wonderful." And Lisa, thank you very much for those kind comments and the coffees. And Lisa had a request for help with tracking down her great-grandfather's war history, and especially anything related to the headquarters company. His name's John Cordial from the 82nd Airborne 505 Parachute Infantry Division. She said, "I can tell from the 82nd Airborne Museum that he participated in Operation Neptune and Operation Varsity and jumped from a C-47. And she's got the plan ID numbers for those jumps, and they're in the show notes with a few more details. Lisa adds that he may have been part of Operation Husky, and that's the invasion of Sicily, and others, but I haven't been able to confirm that. If anyone listening has any ideas or tips for Lisa, then I can forward them. But obviously, Lisa, check out the research tab on the Fighting Through podcast homepage and see if you can grab the service record from the National Military Archives for your country. If you can get the service records of the individual, then that can lead to the unit records, and then, oh my word, you can start joining Facebook forums that cover the areas in question. Then, even, oh for my word, you might even start buying books. But a word of warning here, as soon as you start buying books, that side of your dwelling where the bookshelf is gradually starts to mysteriously subside. One purchase leads to another, and the next thing you know, you keep adding to the collection to the point that you know you'll never read them all. Just ask Todd Kehoe about that. As a sort of PS, Lisa asked me what Blighty was. Well, Blighty is Britain, and it's slang, not really used much at all now, but an example would be talking about a blighty one, which is a wound serious enough to require the recipient to be sent home to England, and it meant an English or British visitor. I've added that one to the official Fighting Through glossary of terms, which you'll find a link to at the very bottom of the home page, fightingthroughpodcast.co.uk. Thanks again, Lisa. German Christoph Keller bought me a coffee, and he said, "Hi Paul, just a small thank you for all the brave men and the stories you've brought to us. I lost a good friend last fall who served with the BAOR, the British Army of the Rhine, in the 1950s, and I loved to listen to his stories and adventures. He was Richard Yarwood, the stepfather of my girlfriend. He grew up in London, and during the Blitz, him and his brother were evacuated to the Isle of Man. Later, when stationed in Hilden, Germany, he was in the army cricket team and got to travel all over the place, even Berlin. I will always remember him. Sincerely, Christoph, Berlin, Germany." Bernie Walker bought me a coffee on Ko-fi, and here's quite an ominous story from Bernie about the hidden Nazi underground threats in America and more. "Dear Paul, I'm a long-time listener and have enjoyed every one of your shows. I'm a history buff since I was a child, and the information that you supply with your podcasts goes to the top of my lists for World War II and some World War I information. I grew up in southern Minnesota and loved the stories my dad and grandpa told of the early 1900s. My grandpa was too young for World War I, and running a farm as a sharecropper with his wife and 4 children, he was too old for World War II. One uncle served in Florida, I believe, in the Air Force in supply. Grandpa lived in northern Iowa. My dad, born in 1933, told a story of them going to visit a neighbour in the early 1940s, as Grandpa regularly did business and trade with all the neighbours, eggs for milk or meat, etc. They went down the driveway and hollered out to the neighbour but didn't get an answer. They checked the outbuildings and no sign of him there either. The guy was often in his basement checking the batteries that were charged up by the old windmill. They had a 12-volt fridge and lights in those days. Many places in the countryside had these, as the power lines had not made it to them at that time yet. So they went down to the cellar from the outside entrance and were so surprised to see a massive shrine to Hitler. A giant picture and German flag with a swastika and other items. They ran back to their vehicle and were happy that the neighbour was nowhere to be seen. And until after the end of the war, they had as little to do with the man as they could without it being obvious that they were avoiding him. I asked why they didn't tell the authorities, and Grandpa said the man had done nothing wrong to them personally, but they kept an eye on him from afar in case anything did happen or anything suspicious was going on. The Midwest of the USA was made up of Germans, Scots, Dutch, Irish, Poles, Norwegians, and all others, many being first and second generation in the early 1900s. In 1985, I was visiting my purchasing agent in Taipei at Taiwan, Chuck Bushnell, originally from near New York. I was visiting their home one evening for a meal. I went to the kitchen to assist Wendy, his Taiwanese wife, and while there she said, "Did you know that you're seated between two of the highest decorated men from World War II?" As the night progressed and the beer and wine was consumed, the stories got better. Chuck was in the US Army Rangers during World War II, and one of his assignments in early 1945 was his team of 4 men who were dropped by parachute 400 miles behind enemy lines to get a very high-ranking scientist out of Germany to work with the Allies. I unfortunately don't know the fella's name, but he was guarded by 400 German soldiers that were housed in 2 large barracks. Only 3 of the Rangers made it to the camp where the scientist was housed, and in the middle of the night they took out the sentries with their knives. One of them secured the scientist, while the others kicked open the barracks, throwing grenades and emptying their machine guns into the soldiers. They took them all out. It then took them 3 weeks to get back to their lines, travelling only at night and away from any villages and roads. Chuck and his squad were personally decorated by Monty. The other gentleman at our meal was a black American colonel, a Marine. He would have gotten to a higher rank, but kept stretching the rules, and he didn't take any crap from anyone who was prejudiced against the blacks in the service. He said that a Marine was a Marine, and the colour of your skin made no difference. He asked where I lived in Australia, and at the time I was living in Leura, just west of Sydney. He knew the area well, as he had several stints recuperating in the Hydro Majestic Hotel just up the road from Katoomba, a beautiful Art Deco hotel that was turned into a convalescent home for wounded soldiers. His first time there was due to bullet wounds from when his unit did their first beach assault. Being there badly wounded but itching to be back with his men, he went AWOL from the hotel, hitched rides, caught trains and got to Sydney, catching the next transport ship that was leaving Sydney, and eventually got back to his unit, where he was reprimanded by the higher brass, but welcomed by his men. He then took part in the next big invasion of Iwo Jima, and got shot there too, eventually ending back up in the Hydro Majestic Hotel. He did the same thing again, and went AWOL, and got back to his unit just before they hit Okinawa. He later went on to fight gallantly in Korea. Regards, Bernie Walker, North Turamura, Australia. P.S. I know that you try hard to get the pronunciations correct of Aussie towns and cities, but when it comes to the word aluminium, the American spelling and pronunciation is correct, as America discovered and named it. I don't know how the English or Aussies screwed the name up. Thank you, Bernie, for all of that. I'm not totally sure of that about aluminum, but I'll let it ride, and I'll let that be the final word on aluminuming, at least for this episode. But I must admit, I thought us Brits invented everything. Bernie added in a PPS that my wife Sabine was born near Hamburg and at a young age moved to South Africa. Meeting her gave me a new view of the war. Her grandfather was in the Wehrmacht. He never returned from the Eastern Front, and the family doesn't know where his remains are. I've heard a couple of stories from the family in Germany. One of Sabine's cousins said to me one day at a get-together that she was told by relatives that the Americans were ready to drop the A-bomb on Berlin to stop the war. She really believed that the Allies would have dropped the bomb in Europe. Can you suggest where we could start to track Sabine's grandfather down somehow? Bernie, the best advice I can give you for starters is ditto what I said to Lisa. Clearly, we're talking about German records here, and I've no idea if they exist. I suspect not, but best of luck. I'll keep a place warm for you on the podcast should you ever find anything out, but Fighting Through Research page is a good starting point to go from. A quick thank you now to Daniel Canales for your feedback on the show and buying one of Dad's books. There aren't that many hardback books left, but if anybody wants a signed first edition, please get in touch. A couple of bits of war stuff now. This one's about resistance or resistance. I must share with you a TV war series which is out, I think mainly featuring on YouTube, but it's about the French resistance, and it's a bit like Dad's Army meets Allo Allo, for anybody who's familiar with those vintage comedies. For others, Resistance is professionally produced, but reassuringly ridiculous, as the cast get themselves in and out of silly scrapes with the enemy. If you watch it, do so alone, because you won't want to be seen crying at some of the capers that they get up to. Personally, I can't stop watching it, so I'd recommend you give it a try. I've posted episode 1 on my homepage for a while, and after that there'll be a link in the show notes. So that's Resistance on a YouTube player near you. And tell them that you heard about it on the Fighting Through podcast. We Have Ways of Making You Talk keeps popping up every now and again. If you're interested in the work of the Western Approaches headquarters referred to earlier, and you want to learn a bit more about its crucial role in solving the mystery of the U-boat's inexplicable success rate, check out episode 275 of the We Have Ways podcast, where James and Al are interviewing someone who knows the answer. So that's episode 275 of the We Have Ways podcast. It's an interview with historian Dave Roberts, and it's great. Over to some family stories now. Chris Canfield wrote a while back now, and he says it's taken me an awfully long time before listening to the 2 wonderful episodes of your conversation with Captain Stan Perry. They were quite the thrill. He seemed to have had any number of close shaves. I listened to the story of how his crew drove up the hill and became separated from the other tanks with mounting apprehension. They might very easily not have come back from that. The first book I ever read about World War II was Brazen Chariots by Robert Crisp, which I think glosses too much over the awful nature of war. But I still maintain a soft spot for the story of the tanker's experiences. To be honest, it wasn't until I read With the Jocks by Peter White that I truly understood the appalling dangers faced by the infantry, particularly in Normandy. Anyway, returning to the episode, what a wonderful treasure you've created for Stan's family. I had a grandfather who served in the merchant marine, travelling to Russia, North Africa, Egypt, Canada and America, but somehow was never torpedoed. He did, however, narrowly avoid injury when his ship collided with another while on their way to Norway. Last year on vacation in the UK, I visited Winchester and the Royal Hampshire Regimental Museum, and it was a weekend, and the museum was staffed by a volunteer who was an ex-Fusilier who described how he nearly grew up in Canada after being sent from the UK to Canada on a ship during the war. He said the ship was torpedoed, they were put in lifeboats, got picked up and returned to the UK, so he lived out the rest of the war with a family on the Isle of Wight, and I think he may have been one of the children on the SS City of Benares. Cheers, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Over to Dan Collins in Canada now. My dad fought for the US Army in Germany. He was wounded, and when he got out of the hospital, the war was over. He stayed for another proud year as an MP in Berlin, passed away in 1993. Daniel, your dad in Berlin must have experienced a lot of what my dad had as a policeman in Hamburg after the war. What a small world, eh? Quick shout out for Vincent from Wyoming now, and he says, I really enjoy military history, so finding this podcast has made being sick this past week a whole lot easier. Smiley face. Thank you, Vincent, and Dean Hayton from Scarborough. That's Scarborough in Yorkshire, where I come from. Yesterday I listened to both Coffees with Claude Reynolds. What a quick-witted and charismatic guy he was. Hearing his pilot volunteering him for an extra mission was hilarious, in hindsight, of course. I don't think Claude found it funny at the time, though. Thanks, Dean, and you've just reinforced my recommendation last episode for everyone to start listening to the earlier episodes for this podcast, because there really are some gems amongst them. You'll hear more about Claude and the ice cracking off the wings in episode 5 and more. Wolfie Wolf is waiting patiently for news of the audio of Dad's book and now Heidi's father's book about the German boy soldier. Wolfie said, "I look forward to them both. My eyes are bad, so I can't read long without getting headaches, even with the right prescription." Wolfie, when I do an audio book, and I hope it'll be this year, you'll hear about it first on the Fighting Through podcast. Right, just a very, very brief roundup. Thank you to everybody who's contributed on this episode. I've got more material than I dare put in, so there's a stack waiting to roll over to the next one. Meanwhile, thank you so much for your support, and keep listening because there's some more good stuff coming on this episode. Thank you so very much for your support and for making the time to listen to me. So please write, like, rate, review, or share the show above all, howsoever it pleases you, and above all, do enjoy. Please do hear me next time. And here's the PS coming up, and the show is playing out with the music of Nick Faint. You heard the instrumental earlier, and Nick is going to be playing Song for the Bad Guys with the full vocals going out, and there's a link to Nick's music in the show notes. So that's Nick Faint. Thank you, Nick, for all your help with this. Now then, PS. Turning to the Allied side of the submarine, I found this on the BBC People's War website, and remarkably, it's the story of an officer on board one of the ships hunting U-111 and others, and it's by Walter Edney. And this is Recollections of World War II by Lieutenant Commander Walter Edney, 1918 to 2003. Commander Edney was twice mentioned in dispatches, and this is an extract from his 1993 autobiography, Scuppers to Skipper. It was May 1940, and although we'd been at war for 6 months, by and large it had been very quiet throughout the winter. The only naval action of any significance had been the Battle of the River Plate, in which 3 of our cruisers sank the Graf Spee, a German armed raider who'd been freely roaming the North Atlantic, sinking our shipping at will. German U-boats had also been quite active in the North Atlantic in an endeavour to cut our lifeline with the USA and Canada. To minimise this, our merchant ships were formed into convoys of up to 100 ships and escorted zigzag across the Atlantic by destroyers. But we had insufficient destroyers for the task. The Germans began a spring offensive in no uncertain terms in April and quickly invaded Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, as well as Norway. They were unstoppable. The huge German machine just rolled forward. So at the age of 21, I was allocated to HMS Vanek to be the leading telegraphist in charge of the ship's communications. HMS Vanek was a World War I destroyer of the V&W class, built in 1917. Although classed as a destroyer, in those days she would not be a match for the present-day patrol boat. Her displacement was in the order of 800 tons, with 1 4-inch gun forward and 1 aft. 6 torpedo tubes and depth-charge throwers aft. Top speed, 27 knots. The total crew, including officers, was about 70. The wireless office, of which I was to be in charge, was situated on the lower part of the bridge and consisted of 2 receiving sets and a very ancient arc-spark transmitter which jammed everyone else within a radius of 20 miles when used. My original communication complement was just 3 telegraphists. When I was appointed to Vanek, she was in Norway doing her best to assist our army stem the German offensive, but in the main evacuating our soldiers who had been cut off. On 8th of June, after most British troops had been evacuated, we sailed for Sullom Voe in the Orkney Islands. On the morning of the 9th, about halfway between Norway and the Orkneys, we were attacked by a German bomber, a Junkers 88, who straddled us with his bombs, doing little damage, except to blow away our aerials. Our stop at Sullom Voe was brief, enough to refuel and re-ammunition, and then it was off to Saint-Nazaire in northern France. The British Army was taking a battering in France with the heavily armed Germans pushing forward on all fronts. Our job was to evacuate as many of the British troops we could and get them aboard for return home. At the same time, in the English Channel, a mass evacuation was taking place at Dunkirk, where a miracle was achieved in getting the majority of our troops home. We'd just completed loading 1 troop ship with some 100 or more soldiers when she was bombed and sunk by German aircraft. I believe 1 bomb went straight down her funnel and blew her to pieces. How many survivors there were I do not know, but not many, I suspect. The job was completed by the 18th of June, when we returned to Plymouth. Nothing much happened until September, when the German Luftwaffe attempted to take control of the air. The Battle of Britain was fought and won by the few. In the meantime, it was our duty at sea to prevent landing craft crossing with troops to land along our south coast. So on the 8th of September, 1940, we were assigned to the anti-invasion patrol in the English Channel. By the 28th of September, the invasion scare was over, and I settled in Portsmouth awaiting next instructions to sail. By now, I'd passed my examinations for second-grade wireless telegraphist, the qualification I needed to advance to petty officer telegraphist. In January 41, whilst in harbour, bombs were dropped close to the ship, and on the 10th we moved out to Spithead. It may have been a lucky escape, as the air blitz on Portsmouth took place, and the town was still burning the next day. A new transmitter and radar had been fitted on the ship, and on 5th of February we departed for Liverpool, and sailed with our convoy on the 9th. These convoy trips lasted about 10 days. We'd stop at Londonderry to refuel. The speed of the convoy was that of the slowest ship, and at best was 6 knots on an irregular zigzag course to avoid torpedoes from U-boats. The weather was often uncomfortable, cold and unpleasant, but the job had to be done to keep our island fed and clothed. The respite in harbour varied between 2 to 3 days to a week, depending on what maintenance was required to be done on board. By this time I was promoted to acting petty officer telegraphist on the basis of the exam I'd passed in August. I was just 22, and not far from my ultimate ambition of being chief petty officer, with 18 years yet to serve. At this time, it was almost unheard of for a rating with less than 8 years of service to be a petty officer, but the war had helped, and I did it in 4 years. I was moved from the sailors' mess deck in the bows of the ship to the petty officers' mess, which was much more civilised and completely separate. It also meant that I could now partake of my daily issue of rum, neat, without water added. Rum was a daily issue to all seamen not of commissioned officer rank over the age of 21. For the sailors it was diluted, 3 parts of water to 1 of rum, and had to be consumed on the spot of issue, 12 noon daily. Alternatively, for those who didn't want a rum issue, they could be paid 4 pence daily. I found the concoction insipid, and elected for the extra pay. However, as a petty officer with neat rum available, I chose the rum, which was lifting to take, and although illegal, could be bottled as it would keep. Mostly I drank mine daily. Another concession of the Navy was a monthly issue of tobacco or cigarettes. This amounted to £1 of tobacco, either pipe or cigarette, or 500 previously rolled cigarettes. There was a small charge for this, but it was negligible as it was duty-free. There was also an issue of leaf tobacco in lieu, if required. This was the plain tobacco leaf which the old salts rolled tightly and bound with tarred hemp, what was known as a prick, and was subsequently cut in thin slices to smoke in a pipe. Guaranteed to make any normal youngster violently sick. It was a dying art. None of the Navy could take that. For my part, I did not bother drawing my tobacco issue, sensibly knowing it was no good for me. The following week I met my future wife on a blind date in Liverpool. The attraction was immediate, and our second date was at the local cinema, where we sat through a heavy raid on Liverpool and then had to walk home all the way from Lime Street in the centre of Stonycroft, a distance of 5 miles. There was no transport running, and more than once we had to drop flat on our faces on the pavement as the bombs dropped. We always made it back uninjured. Thelma and I were married for almost 60 years before she died in January 2003. We had 4 wonderful children and 12 great-grandchildren. The next convoy began quite peacefully, like the others, in a very calm sea to Londonderry for the usual refuelling. Little did we know what was ahead of us. We wasted little time in Londonderry and sailed again at almost full speed, 20 knots, to pick up the convoy. During the night of the 14th, although we'd not met the convoy, it was reported that one of their number, a tanker, had been torpedoed. We finally reached them on Saturday the 15th in mid-Atlantic and joined HMS Walker to bring the convoy home. During the night that followed, 4 more ships of the convoy had been torpedoed by midnight, and it became clear that U-boats were operating amongst this convoy, surfacing and firing torpedoes at will. What use could 2 First World War destroyers be amongst this? Just after midnight, Walker sighted the fluorescent wash of a U-boat retreating on the surface and immediately gave chase, dropping a pattern of depth charges, 10 of them, over the likely diving position of the U-boat. Unfortunately, contact was lost. The U-boat disappeared, and Walker steamed up to pick up survivors from yet another tanker. What was not known was the fact that the U-boat had been damaged by the depth charges and unable to stay underwater for long periods. It decided to surface for inspection of the damage. As it did so, my radar operator immediately reported a dark green blob, which he thought might be a U-boat. This fact was reported to HMS Walker, and both ships then raced at top speed along the bearing given by the radar operator. After a little more than a mile, the silhouette of a U-boat could be seen on the surface, so without hesitation, our captain gave the order to stand by to ram. This we did in no uncertain manner, at full speed, hitting the U-boat amidships and toppling her over. It brought Vanek to a sudden standstill, embedded in the U-boat, which was only cleared by both engines full stern. The U-boat rose high in the air and sunk. The captain still on the bridge, wearing his white cap, but badly injured, he went down with her. There were few survivors, just 5 from a crew of 50, who'd probably jumped overboard before the collision. It subsequently transpired that the U-boat we'd sunk was U-100. Captained by a Lieutenant Captain Schwepke, a U-boat ace who'd sunk many thousand tons of British shipping. A further observation of this action that perhaps made history was the fact that this was the first time that such a primitive and crude radar set had led to the attack on a U-boat, remembering that the set had only been installed a few months before and that the aerial had to be rotated manually. We next swept the surface of the waters with our searchlight in order to pick up survivors. I well remember and will do so always, the cries of those men in the icy waters. Camarada! In my youth, my bitterness towards them was extreme. They'd sunk our ships, and many of our seamen drowned at sea. Their air force, the Luftwaffe, had bombed our cities relentlessly, killing thousands of innocent civilians. I just had to shout, "Leave them there!" Fortunately, perhaps the older members of our crew had more compassion and pulled up the side as many as they could before the next alarm. It had amounted to just 5, 1 officer and 4 men. While we were stopped, recovering the survivors, our sonar operator reported a U-boat echo which placed it directly under our stern. There was only one answer: to get away quickly and depth charge, which we did, followed by a run over the spot by HMS Walker, who also dropped a bank of depth charges. Any further swimmers that may have been in the water, and there were some, could not possibly have survived this fierce attack. After a short while, a U-boat surfaced just astern of us, so close that it was necessary to move out of the way fairly quickly for fear of being torpedoed or fired upon. It was not to be. In fact, both Walker and Vanek opened a crossfire at the U-boat. It was quite clear that she was badly damaged and the crew would have to surrender. The U-boat flashed a message in English to Walker to the effect that she was sinking. The bow of the U-boat subsequently rose in the air and she slithered down to her grave. The whole of the crew took to the water, all saved, including the captain, with the exception of the engineer officer and 2 seamen. What we had achieved! This was U-99, captained by Lieutenant Commander Kretschmann, the unchallenged ace of the German U-boat fleet after Prien, who'd been sunk with his U-boat a few days before by HMS Wolverine, another of the old V and W class. But what of ourselves? The damage to our bow was extensive, but the watertight doors were holding and the engines were sound. We'd be of little use, but we remained with the convoy at slow speed and left them for Loch Ive, Scotland, on the morning of the 18th. We had to leave at this point because we were desperately short of fuel, having steamed at high speed to meet the convoy and used much full power during the action. It took 3 hours to refuel, and we left to rejoin the convoy for Liverpool, but did not proceed into the harbour as usual. We anchored outside at the bay in the Mersey. The following day, March the 20th, we proceeded up harbour at 11 a.m. to be met by the Admiral of Western Approaches and many other top brass. Here we received congratulations all round, discharged our prisoners, and settled ourselves in Gladstone Dock for what was to be a period of repairs to our bow, amongst other modifications. In due course, many months later, awards were made for this action. Our own captain and the captain of the Walker were both awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Our ASDIC operator, the sonar, received the Distinguished Service Medal, and for my part, not that I know what it was, I received a mention in dispatches. I suppose my part had been keeping sound and efficient communications, including the radar, which was my responsibility. Well, that was an extract from Scuppers to Skipper by Lieutenant Commander Walter P. Edney. You can find that on Amazon and possibly other places, and it's been reproduced here by kind permission of Walter's children, John and Christine, with whom I've been in touch. And a final reflection on that story, just in case the coincidence escaped you, they mentioned 2 U-boats which were very close numerically to our beloved U-111 that the last 2 episodes have been about, and I mentioned earlier what a spooky coincidence that was, and my goodness, so it was. Here's just a brief roundup of how the Atlantic War ended up, with a bit of help from Wikipedia. Ultimately, the Germans failed to stop the flow of strategic supplies to Britain. This failure resulted in the build-up of troops and supplies needed for the D-Day landings. Towards the end of the war, the average life expectancy of a U-boat crewman was only 60 days. On VE Day there were 28,000 dead and 5,000 captured, and Dönitz was forced to make the order for all U-boat captains to surface and surrender. But victory was achieved at a huge cost. 3,500 Allied merchant ships, 175 warships were sunk, and some 72,000 seamen lost their lives. The Germans lost 783 U-boats and approximately 30,000 sailors killed, which was 3/4 of Germany's 40,000-man U-boat fleet. I think I meant to say bye-bye now. But you know what a tease I am sometimes. I meant to say it, but I'm not going to, because I've just stumbled across another entry on the BBC People at War website. The story's from Jacqueline Brooks, and she says, "At the end of the war, my father was serving in the intelligence corps, rounding up Nazis and important figures in the area of Schleswig-Holstein and the island of Sylt. He was part of the group who arrested Admiral Dönitz, the head of the German Navy. My father wrote long descriptive letters to my mother, telling her about this and his other experiences. My mother took his letters to our local paper, the Sale and Stretford Guardian, and they printed a long article taken from his letters and including my father's photograph. My father was horrified when my mother sent him a copy of the paper and the article. This was supposed to be secret intelligence, and there was the whole story of Dönitz's arrest gazing up at him from our local paper. My father went on to write a novel based on his experiences in the war, and for many years a painting of the island of Sylt hung above our mantelpiece in Sale." Listener, of course, anyone who follows the Fighting Through Facebook page, link in the show notes, will have seen a photograph I just posted of a British soldier guarding the Nazi leaders who've just been captured. And who knows, Jacqueline's father might be in the background of that photo. The photo does include Minister of Armaments Albert Speer and Admiral Karl Dönitz. And if you look carefully at Dönitz's shirt, I'm almost sure you can see a cherry stain on that collar. Please do me a good turn and share your favourite show in a forum you follow, or a friend. The Tell a Friend tab on the homepage offers some words you might like to copy and paste to make the task easier. I'm Paul Cheall saying bye-bye now. And here's Song for the Bad Guys by Nick Faint, and full links in the show notes.
When I was a boy I used to play with plastic soldiers, green and grey. Greys for bad and greens for good. This I understood. 'Cause the good guys are so squeaky clean. You know they'd never do anything mean. And all those folks they've blown to smithereens should be grateful to be blown up for such a good cause and be on TV in those good guys' wars, even if it's only in small parts. And there'll be no grieving when the bad guys are leaving to that inferno down below, where everyone knows the bad guys go. And none of the bad guys' mums ever held them in their arms when they were babies and loved them like crazy. No, that's just not how it goes. None of the bad guys' sons lost their fathers much too young and spent their lives dreaming of vengeance. when they should be outside having fun in the sun. And it doesn't matter how many bad guys, in inverted commas, that you blow up with your great big bombers. It doesn't take a NASA rocket scientist to be knowing there can be no peace while the well of grief is full to overflowing. And tell me just what you expect to achieve while the body count keeps growing. After all those years you're still wondering why. You've been painted grey, cast as a bad guy. And everybody said the war to end all wars was the one before yours. And how many times can we say that we've learned? And this'll be the very last self-righteous cause. When you mix black and white, you'll only come up with blood red. And there's so many ripples of grief that spread out from every act of bloodshed. There can be no peace while the well of grief is full to overflowing. There can be no peace while the well of grief is full to overflowing. There can be no peace while the well of grief is full to overflow.